Hey folks, Professor K here. So today I want to talk a little bit about CSS selectors and specificity. Specificity, aside from positioning and floats, which are the other things that you're learning right now, is one of the hardest concepts to grasp in CSS, and one of the hardest ones to make sense of. And that's because there's a lot of different elements that go into what makes a selector specific. So I'm going to do a couple different videos today on what contributes to specificity, and then give you some tools for kind of figuring out specificity on the fly. But before we go into all that, I actually want to take you through how the browser calculates specificity so that you can see why we're learning it in the method I'm teaching today. So let's take a look at that. All right, so here we have just a nice little reference on specificity on htmldog.com, and we have pop code over here. And what you'll remember from our past assignments is that in CSS, the Cascade makes it so that rules apply from the top down in CSS as long as the specificity is equal. So as a reminder, here we have two unordered lists and then two list items in each. And if we were to say unordered lists should always have the color red, actually, let's do font family. Let's make this accessible. Let's do font family sans serif, using a shape instead of a color, right? So unordered list should always have the font family of sans serif. If we were to later on in the CSS say that the font family should actually be serif on unordered lists, notice how this has changed. Now it's serif. That's because of the Cascade. It's applying the last possible rule. Now, specificity changes the game here. Specificity says that when you use certain combinations of selectors, it doesn't matter what the order is. Certain rules will apply over others because they are more specific. So here, let's take a look at what would happen if we, instead of using the element selector UL, we use an ID selector of whatever. And that just applies to this top one. So let's see what that looks like. Here we're going to say whatever. And remember, this is at the top, right? So anything with the ID of whatever should have a font family of sans serif. And then all unordered lists should have a font family of serif. What happens in our preview? We see that only this one up top has a font family of sans serif, and the second unordered list has a font family of serif. Even though that second one applies to all unordered lists, this one here, because it has an ID of whatever, wins. That's the basics of specificity. That's kind of like what's happening, is this ID is so specific that whatever styles we put on here will always apply no matter what the order is in the style sheet. So as you can see, specificity is a really important concept to understand. Now, the browser calculates specificity using numbers and math and all kinds of things. In fact, there are entire CSS specificity calculators out there. And the way these are calculated in the browser is by taking a look at how many IDs are involved, how many class selectors involved, and how many element selectors are involved. So let's just do a plain element selector, UL, just like we just looked at. This has a specificity score of 0.1. If we were to instead change that to the ID of whatever, like we just did, now it has a specificity score of 1.0.0. And that's why in popcode, we could see that this won out over this. It has the higher specificity score. And in fact, you can combine selectors to get even more specific about things. You can say UL whatever, and if you did that, it would be 1.0.1. You could chain classes. You could do all kinds of things to kind of determine what the specificity is and get into all kinds of crazy overrides. You could even like throw a hover on there. Hovers count in this kind of second category, so they'll bump this number up. But honest to God, I've never actually used a CSS specificity calculator. I've never even thought about this score. In fact, I only learned this just today to teach it to you. There has been no time in my professional development career where I've had to know the exact specificity score of CSS. Instead, I take a more natural approach to figuring out how specific a CSS selector is based on a few rules. And you can learn how specific a CSS selector is just by kind of breaking it apart and talking through how it applies to the document. So that's how I'm going to teach you today. What is the specificity of a CSS selector? We'll check it on the calculator just to give you an idea. But the idea is I want you to talk through your rule and then think about how broadly on the page it could apply. Then the less broadly it applies on the page, the more specific your CSS selector and the harder it is to override. So let's talk through these two rules first, just to get a feeling of what that sounds like. So here, I am selecting an ID of whatever, and I'm just going to put away this HTML. We don't even need the HTML. We're just going to look at the CSS. So if I select an ID of whatever, how many IDs can we have on a page? 1. That's very specific. This can only select one thing. So this is going to be really hard to override. Whereas here, with the unordered list, how many unordered lists could you have on a page? As many as you want. They can have any class or any ID, and this rule would still apply. So this is much less specific. Let's talk through another couple of rules that we could show here. And let's see if I can hide the preview for a second. And let's see if we can guess what's going to happen. So in our HTML, we have 2 list items here. And let's say that we want our list item inside of whatever to have the font family of sans serif. And then the unordered list, any list item inside of there, we want to have a font family of serif. What's going to win? Well, let's take a look at these 2 rules. This rule right here, whatever.listItem, can only apply to list item classes inside of the whatever tag. Whereas this one can always apply to list item classes inside of any unordered list. There can be more unordered lists on a page than there can be the whatever IDs. So when we talk through this, our first list item is going to get that font family of sans serif. This is going to win. The second one is going to get the font family of serif. Let's check and see if that's what it looked like. Yep, exactly. So we got it right. So what else can we test here? Let's try something harder. Let's go back to just list item and just list item here. So these are 2 selectors of equal specificity. What do you think will win in this case? Give it a second, think about it, pause the video here if you want to test yourself out, and then we'll check and see what the preview looks like. So if you guessed that this bottom rule would win, you'd be right. And the reason why is because this is the same level of specificity to class selectors. These can apply to anything with a class of list item on it. That's not all elements on the page. It's not even all list items on a page. It's only the ones with a class of this list item class. So what would happen? What do you think would happen if we change this second one to LI, the element selector? What do you think would happen? Think about it for a second. All right, hopefully you got a chance to take a good guess there. Let's try changing this to an LI selector. LI, this is an element. So what's happening now? The font family sans serif is winning and the font family serif is losing. Why do you think that happens? Try talking through your selector. How many LIs could you possibly have on a page? Tons and tons and tons, right? That's a really broad selector. But what about list items? The list item class, how many of those can you have on a page? You can have a ton, but this rule will only apply to those items that have this class. So if we take off this class on the second item, see, it only applies to this first item. And that's why it's more specific. You need extra stuff here. You need that extra class to get it to apply. So the basics of figuring out specificity in CSS are really about reading your rule and seeing how specific it is. How broadly could this apply? So just to recap, we have our element selector, which is very, very broad. Next, we have our class selector, which is a little less broad, still very broad, can apply to lots of things, but it requires this class attribute to be on the HTML. And that's why it wins, even though the element selector is after it, even though it's further down on the page in CSS. Finally, IDs will override everything because there can only be one of them on the page. So let's see what an ID of whatever does to this. Let's make the font family cursive. Let's move this ID over so it's a little easier to see. Let's put it on that first one. And now we have the cursive font family. Let's put it on our second list item. Now it applies down there. Even though it's at the top of the page, we could move this anywhere in the CSS, and because of specificity, it doesn't matter, it's always going to win. That's because, again, there can only be one ID on the page at a time in valid HTML. So this is very, very specific, this one. So in the next video, we are going to take a look at how you can chain these and how different levels of specificity work together to make things more specific or less specific. So hang on for just a moment and we'll take a look at that soon.